Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Wozniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at The Oregonian. Today, I'm with Roblyn Brown, who is the wolf program coordinator with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. The agency is known for short as ODFW. And Roblyn is essentially in charge of wolf management and wolf conservation in our state. A pretty exciting and interesting job, I think, but also one that's very hard and challenging. And today we're going to talk about a recent spate of wolf poisonings in eastern Oregon. Poisonings that are killing not just wolves, but also many other animals and birds. And we'll talk about what these poisonings mean in the greater context of wolf population growth or lack of growth, actually, in the recent years in our state. And more broadly, we'll talk about Oregon's approach to wolf conservation. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Roblyn.
Thank you, Gosha. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So there's been a number of these cases of wolf poisonings in recent years. And the latest case was announced in mid May by the Oregon State Police and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And these wolves were poisoned in February of this year in the Imnaha River drainage, which is an area in northeastern Oregon in the Hells Canyon National Recreation Area. Can you tell us what happened? How and when did authorities find these dead animals, and what was the source of the poison?
Yeah, sure. So I received a mortality alert for a radio collared wolf on my phone on a Saturday afternoon in early February. We already
Hmm.
had the helicopter scheduled for wolf capture, so we were able to check on that wolf the very next day. They found the breeding female of the South Snake Pack dead, and Oregon State Police started their investigation that day. Later, an OSP trooper and I were flown in on a helicopter to the remote location where the breeding female had died. Then we flew up to where another dead wolf had been spotted from an airplane during a survey. While flying around, we found three more dead animals: a golden eagle, a coyote, and a mountain lion. The helicopter pilot dropped us off at the top of a canyon on a steep ridge, and then we hiked down about 1,000 feet in elevation, picking up the eagle and the wolf on our way to where the helicopter could pick us up. We were able to land a little closer to the coyote, but I had to attach a long line to the cougar for the helicopter to lift it out of the treacherous spot it had died. And by then we were low on fuel. So later, OSP investigators and more ODFW biologists went out to the canyon two more times to search for the source of the poison and pick up another dead wolf. That was the breeding male of the pack.
That was number three.
Yep, that was number three. Yep. And that's when they found the domestic cow carcass lying in a creek at the bottom of the timbered canyon. Right next to the carcass, there was also another golden eagle, a Steller's jay, and a magpie that were dead.
Wow. What was inside the cow carcass? Did they find what type of poison was used?
Yeah, so there's some parts of these investigations that I'm not going to be able to talk about and maybe not
Yeah.
even know because it's part of an OSP investigation. So I really can't speak much about that.
Yeah. Totally understood. So since we're talking about poison being found in the natural environment and killing lots of animals, this is in the middle of a forest and a river. Can you talk about what the cleanup was like in this particular case, and then any other impacts of the poison on the environment?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we knew the poison was toxic. We had a bunch of dead animals, so we needed to remove it from the landscape so it couldn't kill any more birds and mammals. And the creek was flowing under and around the carcass, so it needed to be removed just in case it might affect the aquatic invertebrates in the creek or the salmon, steelhead, and bull trout downstream in the imnaha River. It was a dirty and dangerous job to remove this large rotten carcass. It's not a normal duty for a wildlife biologist. The Department of Environmental Quality advised us on how to do it safely, and the biologists wore hazardous materials suits, gloves, goggles, and respirators to avoid being poisoned
Wow.
themselves. Yeah. The carcass was rolled up on a tarp and in a net, into a net, and then lifted out by a helicopter. It was a tricky job to avoid the trees just to get it out of there. The carcass was driven to Arlington for disposal, and I hope this kind of thing never happens again and we don't have wildlife biologists ever doing this again.
Yeah, no kidding. Huh.
You asked about
Sounds.
other things being poisoned. So, 2 weeks before the poisoning event, I counted the wolves in the South Snake Pack for our winter count. And at that
Mhm.
time, there was 9 wolves in the pack. It's unknown how many or if any of them survived. So we'll never know how many other wolves died out there or other animals too.
Mm, got it. Got it. Right. So the animals that you found dead near the carcass or the cow carcass or in the area, I mean, those are the ones that you found, but there could have been others that
It could
were
have
just,
been, yeah.
deep in the woods somewhere. that's pretty depressing. So since 2015, poisoning has killed 19 wolves in Oregon, and I'm sure countless other animals. Uh, so 19 wolves, that's a pretty large number killed specifically by poisoning. And I'm wondering if you could put that in perspective. Can you tell us how many wolves overall were killed by humans since 2015? And of those, how many were killed by poachers and with what methods?
Yeah. If it's okay with you, I'll go a little bit farther back to about 2009 when we started keeping mortality information for our wolves.
Sure.
So except in national parks where there's no hunting or livestock grazing, everywhere else that wolves and people overlap, human-caused mortality is the number one cause of death for wolves. That's
Hmm.
standard. And so far, 85% of the known deaths in Oregon have been human-caused, and 34% of those have been illegal take, shootings and poisonings. And we might be forced to acknowledge that wolf management is going to be harder in Oregon than it is in some areas of the northern Rocky Mountains, because Oregon has a higher human population, so there's more impact. If you add the population of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, you still have to double that number to get to as many wolves as there are in Oregon. And Oregon has that population and 70% less space. We have high
Hmm.
prey densities of elk and deer, which allow for a large wolf population, but we have fewer large wilderness areas, higher road density, and a higher overlap of wolf territories with livestock grazing. The
Right.
high human density increases the risk of negative encounters. So, over the last 5 years, we've seen an increase in indicators that wolves are using areas where there's more overlap with people. We've seen the increases
Hmm.
in road killed wolves, human safety reports and take, livestock depredation, lethal removals for chronic livestock depredation, Cotton Act take, and illegal take.
Got it. Got it. So wolves and humans are sort of meeting and butting heads in various ways. And I guess I should clarify too that when we talk about wolves killed by humans, not all of those wolves are killed on purpose by humans.
Correct.
Like some of these are accidents, like a car accident, for example, is a common.
Yeah, we've lost 18
Uh,
wolves from vehicle strikes. And most of those
mm,
have all but one of those has been in the last 5 years. So it just kind of shows
mm,
that overlap a little bit more. You asked about the
mm,
methods that
mm.
poachers use. We do know of 30 wolves that have been unlawfully shot since the year 2000. And of the 19 wolves, most of them have been in the last 3 years. So yeah, poisoning has become more common, and that's very scary. It's more scary for the
Hmm.
wolves,
Hmm.
for the other wildlife species, our hunting dogs, our pets, and for us.
Yeah, yeah, and is it the most common now, sort of emerging method, I guess, of for poachers?
Well, we've lost 30 to people shooting wolves. We've lost 19 to people poisoning, or somewhere
Hmm.
around in there. We
Got it.
probably lose more wolves to poisoning just because it has the potential to kill multiple wolves at a time, versus
That's
shooting is
right.
usually just one.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, because of a single poisoned cow carcass, many animals and
Yeah,
birds can die.
we do think people are targeting wolves just because of the fact that it's mostly wolves that have been dying, just because they're vulnerable to poisoning. So.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So I want to put this into a bigger perspective, a bigger context. Your agency, ODFW, every year puts out a wolf report, which includes the wolf population in our state, the number of wolves we have, as well as the number of wolves killed by people, dying of natural causes, and many other statistics. And these are, of course, wolves and wolf deaths that are known to your agency. So there's probably many more across all the categories. But in April, the latest wolf report showed we have 178 wolves, so just under 200 wolves. And if we look back over the past few years, our wolf population growth has been pretty much flat. The number of wolves hasn't really gone up much in recent years. And I'm wondering whether there's a concern in your agency that the number of wolves killed by people in recent years is getting a little too high and may interfere with wolves' recovery in our state.
Yeah. Well, one thing to remember too is we allowed Colorado Parks and Wildlife to catch 10 Oregon wolves to take and release in Colorado in late December 2023. If those
Hmm.
wolves had stayed in Oregon and survived until December 31st, that count would have actually been 188, which is a 6% increase.
Got
We
it.
would
Got it.
not have shared those wolves with Colorado if we thought it was going to have a long-term negative effect on Oregon's wolf population. But you're right. We experienced double-digit rates of growth, averaging 40% for the first 7 years and 10% for the next 5 years. And so there's two things, well, at least two things, because there's usually more than that, going on with the wolf population growth rate in Oregon. One is
Mm-hmm.
good news, and one is not so good. There's an obvious biological explanation for the decrease in the growth rate. So as wolves start to fill in the available habitat, the population is unable to continue to grow at such a high rate. Wolves are intensely territorial, and too many wolves in an area leads to wolves killing each other or dispersing out of the area. So
Mm-hmm. And we should mention that most wolves in Oregon are in eastern Oregon
yeah,
at this point.
yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. So we expected that the wolf population growth rate north of I-84, where most of the wolves are, would slow down and level off at some point. So part of the decrease in the growth rate actually shows the success of the recolonization of wolves in northeast Oregon. In the West Wolf Management Zone, the wolf count has increased by 39% and 41% during the last 2 years. So they're seeing that increased growth rate because there's a lot of available habitat right now. But in a few
Mm-hmm.
years, eventually the growth rate will level off in that area too. Where the
Got it.
population eventually stabilizes for the area north of I-84 or other areas in the future may be based on wolf
Yeah.
territoriality and human coerced mortality and social intolerance, which can lead to poaching. That poaching brings me to the not so good revelation about the growth rate. Based on studies of wolves in other areas and our population model, we expect our wolf population to continue to increase slowly, even with mortality rates at around 27%. Our annual average documented mortality rate is 13% for the last 3 years. Our observed slow growth rate implies that we may have some additional illegal take that we don't know about, which we would assume we probably do. There's no way to know how much poaching is actually happening in Oregon, but there is
Right.
enough to know it's already affected one of our conservation goals. We had anticipated that the West Wolf Management Zone would move into Phase 2 in 2025, but with the death of the breeding female of the Gerhardt Mountain Pack in December, which is under investigation by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the move into Phase 2 has been set back until 2027 at the earliest. So it is having
Got
an
it.
impact.
Got it. So you had expected the population in the western part of the state to be growing faster, essentially.
Yeah, well, it's growing at 40%, so it's already growing pretty fast.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll probably do that for a while. There's a lot of available habitat out there, but wolves aren't something where they can just be more and more. They don't live in a herd like deer and elk where you can just have more and more of them.
Right.
Instead, they have a territory they have to defend.
Right. Right. So you mentioned conservation zones. Can you talk about how wolves are protected in Oregon today? I know there's sort of two separate areas, and that there's different rules for protection and for how the state manages the populations. Can you just explain very briefly how that works?
Yeah. So no wolves were reintroduced to Oregon. All the wolves in Oregon either swam across the Snake River from Idaho, walked in from Washington, or were born here. Most of them at this
Mm,
point were born here.
yep.
Most of the wolves in Oregon still live in the far northeast corner of the state, but they've also dispersed, and we have many packs in the Cascades and the southern Blue Mountains now. And so we've separated the state into two areas, the West Wolf Management Zone and the East Wolf Management Zone. The East Wolf Management Zone has had more than 7 breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years, so they're in Phase 3. The West Wolf Management Zone is still in Phase 1, and it will be until it has 4 breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years.
Yeah. And these phase one, phase three, what exactly does that mean? That just based on the number of breeding
It
pairs?
is. It's based on the number of successfully reproducing packs in those
Hmm.
areas. And what it allows for is more flexibility. So we have more flexibility in the Phase 3 area of Eastern Oregon because we have more wolves. So there's more
Hmm.
ability to do management if we have chronic depredation, for instance.
Got it. Got it.
Whereas in
And
the Western
uh,
zone, we have very few wolves. So we're still, managing them under Phase 1 criteria when we're looking at chronic depredation.
got it. And when you talk about chronic depredation, that means wolves attacking livestock.
Yes, yes, yep.
Just want to make sure people understand what that vocabulary word means, because I didn't know at first. So okay, so in the later phases, you have more ability to manage and use various approaches to those wolves, including killing wolves that are a chronic uh, killers of livestock, essentially, right?
That's true. We can actually remove wolves anywhere in Oregon for chronic livestock depredation at times when they're not federally protected. So wolves are federally protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act in the western three quarters of Oregon right now. Although the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Fish and Wildlife Service recently released their species status review, saying that wolves do not warrant endangered status in the western United States anymore. Wolves are also
Right.
protected under Oregon statute. They're protected as a special status game mammal in Oregon, and it's illegal to kill them except in certain circumstances, like one of those examples you just mentioned.
Right. Right. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. So you mentioned conflicts with wolves, and I want to sort of talk about the elephant in the room behind all of this, which is that not everybody in Oregon views wolves and wolf protection in the same way. People in a city like Portland and other cities and environmental groups, they see wolves as very charismatic species that was wiped out and that they want to recover to a self-sustaining population. But then ranchers and people in rural areas and farm country, they really dislike wolves and even hate wolves, and they really want them gone from our state because they see them, as dangerous predators that kill their livestock. And I'm wondering how you, as an agency, balance that those sort of two very very opposing viewpoints about wolves. How do you balance that out when you're in charge of wolf conservation?
Well, it's not easy. We're lucky in Oregon to have the Oregon Wolf Conservation and Management Plan that guides our actions. 14 stakeholder groups negotiated years before wolves were even a resident in the state and came up with that plan. It's had
Mm-hmm.
some minor modifications over the years, but it still helps with that balance that you're talking about. The goal is to ensure the conservation of gray wolves while protecting the social and economic interests of all Oregonians. And I'm not going to say we've always do it right, but we're learning, and I'm learning. We need to
Mm-hmm.
focus with the different groups on having common goals. We all need a little more patience and understanding, a little less divisiveness. Livestock producers are being forced to learn a new way to manage their livestock, so they deserve our patience. But people who want more wolves might not understand the fear and stress that livestock producers are dealing with, so they deserve our patience too, as we
Mm-hmm.
remove wolves at times. Wolves are here to
Right.
stay, and so if we have the time to work on the collaboration and compassion, we're going to make it work. Most
Mm-hmm.
producers, by the way, don't hate wolves. What they hate is the stress, financial
Right.
and emotional, that some feel has been forced on them with the return of wolves. They didn't ask for this. Most of us don't like change forced on us. That's a
Right.
normal human challenge. And the additional cost of protecting livestock when wolves are depredating is more than some producers can afford. They also have the ever present worries of weather, drought, grass and water availability, sickness, transportation costs, and market prices. Raising livestock is a high risk venture, and it's the only life and occupation that some of those producers know. And we
Mm-hmm.
need the food and the fiber they produce. I mean, we do. So
Right.
maybe we need to have a common goal to help protect livestock from wolf depredation, because that might be the best way to protect and conserve wolves if we focus more on protecting livestock and reducing conflict. Reducing
Mm-hmm.
conflict with wolves would likely increase social tolerance, which would hopefully reduce poaching. And there's more
Right.
common ground that we can find when we look. Most of us want healthy habitats with healthy wildlife. Some people don't realize that most Oregon wildlife spend all or part of their year on privately owned lands, especially during the winter when survival is hard. And much of that land is owned and stewarded by farmers or ranchers who also want healthy habitats for their livestock. So one of
Right.
the biggest risks of many of our wildlife species is habitat loss or fragmentation. For every ranch that ends up as housing or other development, that habitat's lost permanently. We can all agree that's a challenge.
Right. Right. That's true. So we gotta, in a way, we gotta keep the ranchers happy so they keep ranching.
We have to keep them economically viable. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that. Um, the divide that I just mentioned between people who love wolves and people who dislike them. Obviously, Oregon is not the only state where that's playing out. That's that conflict is present pretty much in all the Western states where wolves were successfully reintroduced. And, wolf protection, federal protection has been heavily litigated. The protections have been dropped and restored. It's just like been a whole mess. And, today, government officials, legislators, ranchers, hunters, some of them feel that wolves have reached recovery levels. You mentioned federal agency coming out with a report that pretty much says that. And then on the other side, conservation groups are saying, no, 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 that's not the case. Wolves have not yet, recovered sustainable levels of populations everywhere. So, sort of beyond that conflict, I have a basic question, which is what does wolf recovery look like? Is it just a population thing? Is there like a population level that we're trying to reach in Oregon? And once we reach it, we're like, okay, we're done. Wolves have come back and we don't have to protect them anymore. Is there more to it than just population? Like, what is successful recovery for our state?
Yeah, yeah, that's a tough one to answer because everybody has a
Mm,
different interpretation of what recovery is. It's just a word,
yeah.
and everybody uses it differently. Some people want to pick various population goals, numbers. Some want to focus on the percent of historical habitat that's now being used. Some want to look at
Mm,
genetic connectivity. The biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has said multiple times that the wolf population has recovered to a level where it does not warrant federal protections. But as you mentioned, other groups do not agree. The word
mm,
recovery is not even defined in the Oregon Wolf Conservation Management Plan.
hmm,
But ODFW and our Fish and Wildlife Commission agreed back in 2015 that the wolf population in Oregon no longer needed an endangered status under Oregon ESA. So you could take that to mean we had already reached a significant level of recovery 9 years ago. But
mhm.
that doesn't really get at answering your question. Everybody has a different definition for recovery. We
Yeah.
haven't picked a final population goal or set a cap on wolf numbers in the wolf
Hmm,
plan. Instead, we watch for conflict and we manage wolves when necessary. The plan requires conservation of wolves while still providing management flexibility to address conflict as the wolf population has grown. And so, you know, recovery isn't necessarily a number. Recovery is the fact that, maybe it's that we have wolves living in Oregon now, we didn't before, and
hmm,
we'll continue to manage them forever, just like we manage all species. There's not like a point
mhm,
where suddenly, bang, it's done and they're recovered. We went through this years ago with mountain lions, where we had them down to a similar number of the number of wolves we have right now in the 1960s. And through a very conservative approach, we stopped hunting for a few years, and then we conservatively started allowing a few controlled hunts with constant monitoring and take limits as the population increased. And the population rebounded well under that management.
got it. Got it. It sounds like Oregon will have to have a discussion at some point in the future about what that will look like for wolves.
Yep, probably many
Yeah,
discussions.
that's true. That's true, considering all the different viewpoints on this. Yeah, thank you. That's a good answers. I sort of another basic question that I have is about if you can talk about why wolves are necessary, and I want to put this in context in that wolves they play a role in an ecosystem, obviously, and the native people who live, the tribes that inhabited this land before Europeans arrived, they seem to have a pretty healthy relationship with wolves. But European settlers did not, and they hunted the wolves pretty much to extinction once they arrived. And wolves have a very bad reputation in European Anglo culture. I have a 6-year-old, and I'm very familiar with children's fairy tales right now. And we have everything from the little Red Riding Hood to Three Little Pigs to countless other books where wolves are a very, very nasty, mean, horrible character. And so it's kind of like embedded in our culture, in our European Anglo culture, that wolves are bad, and that's the culture we come from. And so I'm wondering if you can explain, this is sort of a subconscious thing that we may have in the back of our mind, but can you explain why wolves are beneficial? Like, what is the purpose of having them here? Why did we even want them here and want to continue, supporting their presence in our state?
Yeah, yeah. I'll try and get at that. So you're right. There was far more coexistence with nature before European settlers arrived. It seems like it's human nature to want to move to new places for the characteristics they have, but then end up trying to change them to match where you came from. It's not
Right.
uncommon in Oregon to hear people complaining about Californians moving in and changing things to be more like California, or a person moving from the city to the suburbs where there's more nature than complaining about the deer eating their flower garden. So,
Right.
Europeans had wiped out many of the predators in Europe well before they came to America. And as they
Yeah.
moved across the country, it was natural for them to make it more like their homeland. And remember, they were subsisting off the land the only way they knew how. The deer and elk numbers had dropped or had entirely disappeared from many areas. So the wolves that were left only had livestock to eat, and that wasn't going to work for the settlers. Plus, you're right about the fear factor. We're told fables about the big bad wolf, and we see terrifying Hollywood movies. Fortunately, there isn't much truth in that drama. By the way, for anybody that's nervous about their safety when they're out there in the woods around wolves, we've got a great video on our website. It's called What to Expect If You Encounter a Wolf. Just do a search on YouTube. It has over 20 million views, so it'll pop up. Um,
Excellent. Well, I will link to it in the show
that's awesome.
in the online post of it.
Thanks,
So
Gosha. I appreciate that.
yeah,
Yeah, some people talk about the changes that wolves have made since they've returned to Yellowstone National Park. That's a popular
that's right.
topic. Talking about trophic cascades. They've helped they say they've helped the habitat, the willows, the streams, and even small birds. And that wolves did this by reducing the overabundant elk population. Well, most of
Right.
these claims don't hold up when you're looking at lands outside national parks, where hunting has been used to keep elk populations at a socially acceptable level. So it's different outside of Yellowstone or Zion National Park.
Mm-hmm.
Wolves are returning to a different Oregon than we had in the 1800s when wolves were persecuted and poisoned. Our ecosystems have been modified and they can't be returned to the way that they were. But
Right.
steps can be taken to try and repair some of those changes. And public perception has changed about the intrinsic value of having wolves and other top carnivores on the landscape. And that's important in and of itself. I hope everyone listening gets to someday hear the amazing sound of a wolf howl as it echoes across the forest.
Mm. I hope I get to hear that. Um, what do you see as the best tools to help wolves in our state?
So, minimizing livestock conflict and reducing livestock losses to wolves is the most important part of the plan. It's an important part of the plan. So we help with assistance to producers to protect their livestock, to reduce the
Mm-hmm.
vulnerability of their livestock.
Yeah.
Um,
Can you give us some examples of how you do that, or like some of the methods that you use?
yeah, there's a lot of different tools, a lot of different techniques. Some of that is funded through the Oregon Department of Agriculture. They run a state wolf compensation program. And so they pay 100% for confirmed and probable losses and injuries to livestock, but they also provide financial assistance through county committees to decide that decide where to spend that money. Almost $500,000 last year. That's
Mm-hmm.
not enough, and some producers aren't getting what they need or even know what to ask for. The biggest
Mm-hmm.
thing that's most helpful in Oregon to help reduce future livestock depredation is the removal of attractants. Anytime those attractants are near a calving area or a winter feeding area, we've seen that over and over and over again that makes those livestock that are near bone piles or carcasses more vulnerable to depredation because the wolves are scavengers. And so they'll
Mm.
come in and they'll spend time visiting that attractant, eating on that carcass,
Okay.
just
So
like the.
attractant is a carcass, like let's say a dead animal, a
Yep.
wild animal, or a dead cow that just was left to rot there.
Yeah, so it's really common for livestock producers to have bone piles on their property. In the winter, there's always a lot of
Mm.
dead loss. There's no way there's not going to be dead loss with calves or
Mm-hmm.
adult cows during the birthing, complications from birthing. So it's
Yeah.
always been common to have that bone pile on the property, and it's never been a problem. Coyotes don't cause problems. They go and they clean it up. Birds, scavenging birds, clean it up, and it's not a problem. But with
Hmm.
wolves, that particular situation, either having a carcass near a calving area or a bone pile in the area.
Mm.
And we're
It's
just
like a
talking about,
magnet.
it's an attractant. It's a magnet to wolves to come into that area where people are already feeding. So this is more common in the winter This is more smaller
Mm.
with common and smaller and medium pastures. And so reducing that risk by not having wolves attracted to that area, they'll hopefully stay up in the forest and not come into the valleys. This is not talking about the odd cow that dies out on a Forest Service allotment. It's not talking about
Right.
the deer that gets hit by a car. It's talking about, areas where somebody has an attractant really close to their feeding operation or their calving operation. And so we've seen that over and over. Cleaning those up has been helpful. But not every producer has a backhoe and can bury them. Not every county dump will take items for free. Some counties
Mm.
do. Some producers have backhoes. But for those producers who don't have that, we've got to have some way of assistance for them. Um,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Ranchers have a strong desire to protect their livestock from all dangers.
Right.
But it might cost a producer $20,000 or $30,000 to implement protective measures on his livestock over a year, and that money might or might not stop a depredation that he might or might not have had happen. So the cost benefit analysis might say he's wasting his money he might not have. So if we want to reduce conflict so we can have more wolves, we need to have financial support to develop and implement effective tools and techniques for those producers. Wolves do
Yeah.
very well by themselves. They're not limited by a lack of habitat or prey in Oregon, and they're very successful at reproducing. When it comes down to it, wolf management is mostly about reducing conflict. And
Mm.
reducing wolf
Mm-hmm.
livestock conflict helps people, it helps the livestock, and it ultimately helps the wolves. And it's critical to ensure long-term conservation of wolves.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I was going to say, I mean, you mentioned that wolves do have enough to eat. I mean, the elk populations that they prey on, that they're they're high enough for them to be sustainable as a food source, correct?
In most areas, it's possible that in the future we're going to have challenges in areas where there aren't a large population of elk or there aren't a lot of deer. Wolves
Mm-hmm.
are going to continue to keep trying to find a place to live as the habitat fills in. So
Right.
we'll in the future probably see more conflicts with wolves in areas where there might not be an adequate prey base, such
Got
as
it.
the
Got
Willamette
it.
Valley.
Right. 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 Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned a compensation program for ranchers who do lose their livestock. Is that enough? That they get basically reimbursed for a cow or calf that gets killed by a wolf, correct?
Right, they get reimbursed for that cow or calf that they find early enough that we can get out there and do an investigation and confirm that a wolf killed it. But
Mm.
they don't find everything in time, and certainly not in larger pastures, forested pastures or canyons. They're not going to
Mm-hmm.
find everything. So they're compensated for the ones that get found, but they're
Mm-hmm.
not compensated for the ones that they never find. And they're
Yeah.
also, they would say, not compensated for some of the other costs. So, it's absolutely true that wolves test livestock at times, looking for vulnerability. And so during
Mm-hmm.
that time, they might push those cows through a fence. So now they have to go back
Mm-hmm.
and fix the fence. They have to round the cows back up. The cows might be agitated because they've been chased by wolves,
Mm-hmm.
bit at the heels. And so there's a
Right.
lot of other things that are happening with producers that are happening to producers that they have to handle, you know, and those things are very expensive and they're not included in that compensation that they get for the animals that are killed or injured.
Right, right. Yeah, and I guess as a reminder too, I mean, these are ranches that are very large in many cases that are, in wooded areas, that these are not like little patches of land where cattle are. So I mean, and often these cattle are left out for days sometimes. Sometimes the ranchers probably come by on a regular basis, but these are not cattle that are sitting like next to the rancher's house, basically, is what
Right,
I'm
but
trying to
but
say.
sometimes,
So they're in remote areas.
yeah, but sometimes it is. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it's wolves coming into the valley and killing livestock right near houses, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I'm assuming it's probably a lot more common for them to go to those remote areas where there's no humans to interfere with them.
Well, one of the things that happens, Gosha, is that in the winter, our ungulates, our deer and our elk, have to leave the higher elevation areas, and so they move down into the edges of the valleys to live for
Mm.
the winter, in places where they can find feed and not be in the deep snow up high in the mountains. So So during those times, the wolves are living in those areas hunting elk, but occasionally they're also finding a vulnerable livestock animal, whether it's a sheep or
Right.
a calf.
Right. So in the winter, essentially, they move a little closer to us.
They do, they do.
Yeah.
And in the
Yeah.
spring as well. So in the spring, calves are often born in January, February, but the deer and the elk, fawns and calves aren't born until end of May and June. So
Mm.
during that period of time from February, especially March and April when they start to put out on fresher green grass, depending on the area of
Hmm.
Oregon, those are the most vulnerable animals out there at those times.
Mm.
Mama cows can be really good at protecting their calves, but
Hmm.
they're not always there, 24/7 standing over that calf. So
Right.
there's a lot of
Right.
risk during that time period.
Mm. Fascinating. Going back to the poisonings. So poisoning is a wolf is a Class C felony in Oregon, punishable by up to $125,000 fine, up to 5 years in prison. Poaching federally protected wildlife such as golden eagles is also a felony, and people face multi-thousand-dollar fines for that. Have we had any convictions of wolf poisonings or wolf poachings in Oregon? And why is it so hard to catch people who are doing this to animals?
Yeah. Yeah, it is hard to catch poachers. The outdoors is a big place. Often there's no one around to see what happens. Our law enforcement officers have been working to catch deer and elk poachers for years, and they're good at it. But one of the biggest problems is that even when someone sees somebody do something illegal, they're
Hmm.
unlikely to turn that person in.
Right.
And so, we've had no convictions yet on any of the poisoning cases. 4 people have been prosecuted in court for shooting wolves illegally in Oregon. A couple of
Mm.
those individuals turned themselves in when they realized they'd shot a wolf when they thought they were shooting a coyote.
Mm.
And a couple other cases were made after law enforcement did a bunch of investigative legwork and caught the poachers.
Mm. Mm. So sometimes they're caught, but not very often. There is a pretty large reward for this one. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is offering $25,000 for information leading to an arrest or conviction in the case of these poisonings and the golden eagles poisonings. And there's also a Oregon Wildlife Coalition $11,500 reward for information about this case. So it's folks are trying to convince people to talk about this.
Yeah, and I
I
want to
think.
convince them too. So that tip
Yeah.
program, you can be anonymous. You don't have to share your name to get those
Mm-hmm.
rewards and to help out our wildlife. So, there's other rewards available. There's a $50,000 reward from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for information on the Gearhout Mountain Pack wolf deaths in December. There's 11,500 on info for any of the wolf shootings or wolf poisonings, including the ones in Union, Baker, and Umatilla counties in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
We hope the rewards will lead to more convictions, but we need the public's help to protect our shared wildlife and report illegal or suspicious activity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this is obviously impacting our wildlife and also dogs because
Yep.
dogs have been poisoned by the very same poison that was meant for wolves. And so, what is the impact on folks who are using these recreation areas? So, we have spring and summer coming up, and hikers are going into these areas, to hike a camp. Their dogs are coming along. Hikers often put their hands in streams, sometimes use the water to drink. Like, given the fact that these poisonings have been happening on a regular basis in recent years, like, is there anything that folks using the wild areas should keep in mind when it comes to their own safety or the safety of their dogs?
Yeah, yeah. Well, most of these poisonings have not happened in the wilderness areas up in the Wallowa Mountains. Most of these have happened
Mm.
in Wallowa, Union, Baker, Umatilla counties. They've been on
Hmm.
private lands and they've been on the Umatilla National Forest and the Wallowa Whitman National Forest. And so, I'm not the one to give advice about poison in the water. I'm still going to wash my hands in the water out there. I'm still going to drink the water when I use a filter. I think the chance is
Hmm.
pretty low for a person to even be near it. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I don't know about that. But for dogs, there's some things that we can do. keeping your dog on a leash and under control, and like as you're walking down a trail, make sure they don't eat anything that they find in the forest.
Mm-hmm.
Don't let them run loose so that they find a carcass and get into it. Um,
Right.
some of the dogs that have over the years been poisoned in Oregon that probably ate poison that has been put out for wolves, they were hunting hounds that might have been running loose, or bird dogs that somebody was hunting with. So
Mm-hmm.
one thing, I work with a coworker who carries a solution in a syringe when he goes hiking to be able to give his dog to force him to vomit immediately. And so
Oh.
people can certainly reach out to their veterinarians for advice about what to maybe carry with them in case they're going to be way
Mm-hmm.
back in the wilderness and they can't get to a veterinarian very fast. Otherwise, if you're in the front country, just out camping in the forest, you can probably just make it into town and go to a veterinarian. But that's something
Right.
my friend does just so he can have something right there to force his dog to
Mm-hmm.
vomit. Um,
Yeah,
a,
that's
a,
good advice.
a big thing is to just kind of be aware of your surroundings when you're out there. Watch for dead animals and watch for, you know, eagles and ravens and jays that are dead because that might indicate that there's something nearby that's poisonous. So you want to just be aware of your surroundings and paying attention. Um,
Mm, got it.
but
Thank you for that.
yeah.
Um, to close our show, you mentioned at the very start how when these poisonings happened, were helicoptered out to the area and sort of were on the ground. And it sounds to me like your job entails a, a, some amount of being out in the wild with the wolves, or in the areas where the wolves may roam. uh, and I'm wondering if you have a favorite story, either of an encounter that you've had personally with a wolf, or just a really cool wolf pack or specific wolf that lives in Oregon that you can tell us about.
Um, yeah, wolves are amazing animals. I mean, well, actually, every wild animal is amazing in my eyes. They're all in this constant struggle for survival, and only the well adapted and the lucky individuals find enough food and survive the harsh conditions in nature. So, something really cool about wolves is their incredible stories of dispersal.
Hmm.
They leave the pack when they're born, that they're born in, and they may travel 5 miles or they may travel thousands of miles looking for a new home and a mate. We put out a
Hmm.
short video about the travels of some of Oregon's radio-collared wolves last year. One of them traveled more than 4,500 miles before he found a new home and a mate, and that's
Wow.
the same as jogging from Oregon to Florida and back.
Wow.
So you can go to any web browser or YouTube and just type in wolf dispersal and it'll pop up. Or it'd be great, Gosha, if you put a link on the here. That'd be
I will do
great.
that.
I want to tell more stories about wolves so people start to understand that wolves are not that they're more just one more wildlife species trying to make a living out there on the landscape. Wolves are not scary, bloodthirsty demons, and they're actually not very similar to our pet dogs except in appearance. So we'll continue to monitor the wolf population intensively so we can make an accurate count and identify the threats to the population. But we need to remember wolf populations are pretty
Got it.
resilient. Um, and even in protected areas, there's changes that happen in packs, and we're going to see that here over time.
Well, Roblyn, thank you. This has been a really important and interesting conversation, and we're going to be following this topic in future stories in the Oregonian and on OregonLive.com. And I'm going to drop several links to relevant stories, as well as the two videos that you mentioned in the show notes in the online post. And thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It helps people find the show. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live, and you can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time, thank you.